All right, I see folks are still trickling in, but we're actually going to get started. And as I do my intro, I know more people will be joining us. But Nyawe Skeno, Nigieso, Kristen Kazak, Onondoaga Nia, Agiswe Gayo. My name is Kristen Kazak. I am Seneca Hawk Clan from the Allegheny Territory, and I am Polish. I'm really excited that you all could join us today, and I'm excited to be with you today. I think we have a really great group, and we have really great presenter who has done this for many years. So I just wanted to express my gratitude to you all for Buffalo City Budget 101. A special thanks to Brian Bornkamp, who has researched the budget for a number of years and had previously offered a lot of trainings. And I just wanted to express our appreciation for walking us through this seemingly nebulous document that really impacts all of us. And so it's really important for us to get a firm grasp on understanding it and be able to walk through it. For those of you who have joined us for Buffalo Commons workshops, you know, I typically spend a chunk of time at the beginning sharing about some of the things we're able to offer. I will share a little bit, but I've abbreviated this time just because in addition to Brian, we have another expert that we're grateful could join us today as well, Vanessa Glacierski. Vanessa worked as Deputy and Acting Comptroller for the City of Buffalo, and she's just going to share, maybe for 5 or so minutes, some brief reflections at the end of the presentation before the Q&A. So first, I just wanted to let everyone know that I'm going to be recording today's sessions. We had some people who wanted to attend, but who are unable to at this time. So if you have a question or issue with it, you can send me a quick email at buffalocommons@cornell.edu. I'll type it in the chat. Or you can send me a quick chat, and I've kept my name as Buffalo Commons to make it easy. As I said, my work on Buffalo Commons is a joint collaboration between Cornell ILR Buffalo CoLab and Partnership for the Public Good. PPG, for those of you who may not know, is a local, as in Western New York, community-based think tank with over 300 organizational partners. There's a few things we regularly work on. One is a digital library. So there's over 500 resources that are specifically about Buffalo or Western New York. It's available on the PPG site and on Cornell's digital library. If you or your organization has any resources and really wants them amplified, we would love to help share them. So you can get in contact with us to do that. Second thing we work on is a researchers network. So there's over 175 different researchers from the 21 institutions of higher education we have locally from Cornell and people who aren't affiliated with any sort of institution. We know people do great work outside of the academy as well. So if your organization, if you're a nonprofit or other, has research needs or questions, we can usually pair them with one of these people who are part of the researchers network. And again, you can reach out, or we have a form on our website that you can fill out. The third thing we do is feature workshops. We usually offer them in person, but as you see today, we've transitioned to offer them virtually, which is a good and bad thing. Sad in the fact that we can't get to know each other and see each other's faces as much, but really good in the fact that we can host more people. So we're glad to get this to as many people as possible. I'll put a link in the chat to our calendar of our upcoming workshops as well. And we'll mention at the end of this just some of the content for ones that we'll be featuring. And just a reminder, at the end of this workshop, we will be sending out both the recording of today, a feedback survey, and any of the resources that are shared. Just so that you don't have to be frantically trying to do anything or take notes. You can revisit this or send it to folks that you know at any time. Just a few quick housekeeping things. You may be familiar with Zoom, but there is a mute option. I feel like we've done this a million times before, that we do encourage you to use while Brian is presenting, but we also encourage you to use the chat function, which is available at the bottom of your screen if you scroll your mouse down. Since we can't be in person, we can pretend as much as possible to have a dynamic chat. I think that's what we get from really great groups. So to make sure the chat is working, we invite you to type your name, your organization if you're affiliated with one, and one of the reasons you decided to join us today, something you hope to learn, or a big question you're really trying to answer. I think that'll give us a good sense of making sure that we try to answer these throughout the presentation. Well, we'd love to see your faces regularly, and I know I see some of you on your cameras. If you are having any connectivity issues, as I know I sometimes do, being in the basement, to reduce the bandwidth that your computer is using, you can temporarily turn off your video, or you can exit out of any other programs or applications you're using. For me, it's usually Outlook that takes up a lot of space. So as I said before, I'll be regularly monitoring the chat, so you can ask questions at any time. We really encourage that. And again, we'll be sharing any links or resources and the recording in a follow-up email after the presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Brian to get us started.
Great. Thanks, Kristen. Yeah. So hopefully my screen is showing up, everybody. If for any reason it stops showing up, let me know. I can stop and figure out what technical issues. But yeah, so for today, we've got a Buffalo sort of budgets 101 workshop. I'm going to be covering 3 of the sort of larger City of Buffalo budgets that recur every single year. So we're going to be looking at the capital budget, which is, think of as capital projects, so physical objects that get built in neighborhoods. The operating budget, or sometimes called the mayor's budget, which is an annual budget that covers a wide array of city expenses, and it's by far the largest, and Cdbg, or Community Development Block Grant, which is program from the federal government through Housing and Urban Development that gives about $13 million in anti-poverty funds to the City of Buffalo every year that can be used for sort of capital projects or programmatic projects. Yeah, so let's try to make this a little bit bigger, and then we can get started. Just a little bit of background in terms of like how I came into doing research on budgets. So I was sort of an advocate and an organizer through the Clean Air Coalition in Western New York for a number of years, trying to advocate for budgeting that get residents sort of the ability to decide how resources get spent in their neighborhood directly, right? So residents are able to vote on projects and decide what kinds of projects they want to see happen in their neighborhood, as opposed to, right, distant electeds or bureaucrats in City Hall making those decisions. But during the course of that, right, the one question that would always get from City Hall is, well, how are you going to pay for it, right? Which is the question they love to ask, right? And so in trying to understand, well, how do we get new budget spending, right, I had to understand the current budget process. And so hopefully today, what I'm hoping to kind of walk you through is sort of the structure of the budgets in terms of how much money there is, where that money comes from, but also where that money goes. But then for those of you that are interested in doing advocacy, what the process and what the timelines are around those budgets and how those decisions get made, so that you know when to effectively advocate and at what point you need to interject yourself into the process, but then also who makes those decisions, so that you're able to identify appropriate targets to secure the kind of budget line items that you may want. So that's going to be the gist. I'm going to try and pause at the end of each slide to make space for questions before moving on, to make sure everybody's kind of moving at the same pace. If something's like a little out of scope, or if it's maybe a little too big of a question, I may try to put it in a bike rack or a parking lot, and we can always loop back into it at the end. We'll have a bit of extra time there. So that's kind of what to expect for today. So, so where's our money come from? So I think Buffalo takes in about $520 million every year. That's current appropriation, right? And so a big chunk of that comes from sort of the section of special state aid. Another section comes from property taxes. Another chunk comes from Erie County sales taxes. And then there's a bunch of other smaller little cuts in here, right? Everything from the STAR program to cable franchise fees, to mortgage recording taxes and things of that nature. So this is a sort of more specific breakdown based on some of the numbers in the budget. If you look in the budget itself, it'll also give you another graph. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Just a really quick question.
Sure.
Your audio is just a tiny bit choppy. I don't know if you're able to turn it up a little bit, and I don't know if you're able to close out of anything. We're just having a little bit of trouble hearing you.
Yeah, sorry about that. I'm gonna try doing this. Let's see here. If I stop my video, can you still see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, I'm gonna try stopping my video and see if that helps. Let me check the microphone settings real quick. Audio settings. All right. If I'm speaking now, is this sounding any better, or is this any worse, or about the same?
Yep, that's a lot better for me right now.
Okay, great. So yeah, so City of Buffalo revenue, right? So the largest share comes from the state, right? Another chunk comes from the city in various forms. Another chunk comes from the county. And there's a few other smaller pots of money in between. So the first budget I'm going to talk about is the City of Buffalo's capital budget. And so, like I said before, this budget is primarily used for infrastructure projects. So stadiums, roads, sidewalks, new buildings, fire trucks, things like that. So anything that you can kind of touch that exists in the real world. The general process for this budget is before I talk about the process, one important thing to keep in mind is that these are all bonded projects, right? And so a bonded project is basically a project that the city takes on a loan from, a loan to construct, right? So the city goes up to the market, they sell a bond, which is effectively a loan, right, for X number of dollars for the size of a project, right? And then slowly over time, they pay back the principal and the interest on that loan as a way to fund the project sort of all up front at once. And so because we are going out to market to sell bonds and sell loans, the first part of the capital budget process happens in August 1st, right, which is where the city comptroller sets the borrowing limit. So the city comptroller takes a look at the city finances and says, you know, based upon the numbers and my sort of personal intuitions, this is what I think is a safe, reasonable borrowing limit for the amount of money that we can allocate towards the capital budget process. Currently, that amount is about $25 million for the last capital budget cycle. So once the size is determined, the next thing that happens is there is a body in City Hall known as the Citizens Planning Council. And sort of the Citizens Planning Council it's a 14-member committee. 8 people are appointed by the mayor, 4 people are appointed by the Common Council, and 2 people are appointed by the school board. And it's the role and the job of this committee to come up with a draft capital budget. And so they effectively come up with a list of projects and dollar amounts for the cost of getting those projects completed, and some plans for how those projects move forward. And they will then submit that by September 15th. They'll put out a draft of the budget, and then that goes to the mayor's office. So once the mayor's office has the draft budget from the Citizens Planning Council, the Office of Strategic Planning, sometimes known as the quote-unquote the 3 men in the room, can look at the budget and they can make changes to it, right? So they can move projects, they can add projects, they can change the dollar amount on projects, right? They take the draft and they can workshop it. The one thing to note, though, right, is because the Citizens Planning Council it's 8 out of 14 members appointed by the mayor's office, right? They already have a default majority of sort of voice and opinion when creating the draft capital budget. So usually by the time it gets to the mayor's office, it already has most of the mayor's priorities already reflected inside the budget. So there's not typically a lot of changes that happen at this phase. There have been some changes in the past, but typically there's not a lot. And so once the mayor's office sort of workshops and massages the draft, by November 1st, the mayor releases his proposed capital budget to the Common Council. And so once the Common Council has a copy of the budget, they can do one of 3 things with it, right? So they can approve the budget as is, they can reject the budget, or they can amend the budget. If they make amendments to the budget, then it typically has to go back to the mayor's office for approval, and 6 out of 9 council members can override a mayoral veto. So that's the general process. So it starts in August, right, by determining the size of the budget. By September 15th, the Citizens Planning Council puts out a draft. By Mayor 1st, the mayor's office makes any changes, and then by December 15th, right, there's Common Council approval, and then by the time January kicks over and the holidays are over, right, City Hall starts working on how do they implement these projects. So any questions on sort of the process of the capital budget? Who is on the citizens plan? Okay, so it looks like someone, yeah. How are the members of the Citizens Planning Council appointed? Yeah, so I mean, it's effectively the mayor's office chooses his 8 people, the Common Council as a group choose their 4 people, and the school board choose their 2 people. And so whatever decision-making or approval process that body has amongst themselves is how they would choose their appointees. I do believe that the Common Council does vote on their appointees, so there is some sort of Common Council resolution saying we hereby appoint so-and-so and so-and-so to the Planning Council. How often are the members appointed, and how long are their terms? Let's see, not sure if I have it on here. I believe the terms, I'd have to check. I believe the terms are 3 years, but we can definitely parking lot that, and we can look that up towards the end of it, towards the end of the workshop. Okay, great. One more question. Where do the Citizens Planning Council usually get their ideas for budget items? Are they specifically connected to community groups, constituencies, et cetera? Yeah, so that is a great question. How does the sausage get made? You know, I don't really know. So I think depending on the member of the Citizens Planning Council, right, they may have their own individual political relationships, and they may have their own level of involvement with the Citizens Planning Council and that process. Yeah, the chair of that body is Adam Russ, which is sort of he's an attorney at, or no, not Adam Russ, Adam Perry, who's an attorney at Hodgson Russ, and who's a sort of a close ally of the mayor, right? And because most of those folks are appointed by the mayor, my inclination would be to tell you that most of their ideas probably come through the mayor's office or through some close political ally of the mayor. There isn't any sort of requirement that the Citizens Planning Council hold a workshop or a community input day. So really where their ideas come from is ultimately just at the behest of each individual appointed to the Citizens Planning Council. Don't the departments with capital needs put together the initial proposals? And are there qualifications to become CPC members? I'll take those in reverse order. There's no qualifications, right? It's just whoever gets appointed. In terms of so departments can submit proposals to the Citizens Planning Council as a part of the process. The Citizens Planning Council doesn't have to sort of approve them or address them, but yeah, certainly every department head could send in their proposed items that they want for that year. So that's actually probably one of the ways where folks do get some of their ideas. Okay, I'll move on to the next slide. So here's an example of what happened last cycle for the Citizens Planning Council. And just to give you an idea of what this budget actually looks like. So, right, some of the things that are in there, right? So purchasing of new fire trucks, purchasing of new fire buildings. Buffalo, the police department got, some 20 new vehicles. They got a new shooting range. Permits and inspections got $1 million for demolitions. The IT department got some money, right, for some upgrades. DPW got some money for some upgrades. And then some cultural organizations got some upgrades. I do have links to some of these documents at the end, so if folks want to look through these more in depth, we'll have those available. All right, CDBG. So CDBG is like I said, this is a federal anti-poverty initiative. and gives the city of Buffalo about $13 million every year. The funding amount does vary. It can go up or it can go down, but usually it's around that $13 million mark. One of the sort of mandates is that about 70% of the funding has to be used in sort of low-income areas throughout the city of Buffalo. And so the program cycle generally goes where City Hall determines its sort of broad level priorities at sort of a categorical level. And then in April, right, agencies can apply for funding based on those categories and based on what an individual agency wants to do. So this would be, when I say agency, usually thinking nonprofit or any sort of organization that does work in the city of Buffalo. By May, they put out a draft action plan saying, hey, this is specifically where we're going to send our money and this is what's going to go where. And then by June, the council votes. And then in July, the mayor has to send it to HUD for approval. And usually when it goes to HUD for approval, it's more of a rubber stamp, just making sure that they're complying with the law, as opposed to anyone in the federal government really taking a hard look at the proposed budget to scrutinize it for, impact or something like that. And most of this process is all held within the Office of Strategic Planning in terms of who's actually administering the process. So that's the gist on CDBG. One other thing about CDBG is to show you this map, right? So in terms of that 70% of funds needing to be used to benefit persons with lower moderate incomes, right? This is the map. Anything in red in the city of Buffalo is considered to be low or moderate income, where at least 51% of the households meet that criteria. The one thing that I will say in terms of how they determine what counts as the sort of income threshold is it's based upon the area median income, right? So including, all the suburbs, Amherst, Clarence, Cheektowaga, et cetera, and not just the city of Buffalo. So, and as we know, there's a wealth gap between the city of Buffalo and the suburbs. And so as a result, right, most of the city of Buffalo gets counted as a lower moderate income area. Let's pause here real quick. Any questions about CDBG? Yeah, so in terms of the other 30%, it can go anywhere in the city of Buffalo, right? So you could pay some sidewalks in the Elmwood Village. You could put 100% into the low and moderate income areas. There's not a whole lot of heavy process or teeth around CDBG. It's pretty flexible in terms of how the city wants to administer the funding. Yeah, so under the impression it's only for certain zip codes. So that may be how City Hall is trying to determine the low and moderate income area. And so City Hall may be internally setting a process saying, hey, we're only going to send this money to these certain zip codes. And so just to give you a brief example of one of the more recent cycles, right? So this is where some of that money went, right? So good chunk with the housing. Clearance is another way of saying demolitions, right? And so you may be noticing some themes that some of these budget overlap, right? Capital budget had money for demolitions. CDBG has money for demolitions. Community facilities, parks and pools, streets, sidewalks, public services, program delivery, et cetera. One thing I would also just mention as a little side note, about half of this budget ends up moving through BURA, which is the Buffalo Urban Renewal Agency. Haven't checked recently, but last I looked, it was about $6 million moved through BURA, which is a quasi-public entity known as a public benefit corporation, private agency staffed by city officials. All right, and so this is the big budget, right? So the operating budget, also sometimes known as the mayor's budget, and the one thing I'll say real quick, right, is sort of these three bubbles here are the hard process defined in law. But if you do want to get ahead of the process, one thing you can do that we did done successfully when I worked at Clean Air is filing a request to the clerk's office to have the council hold a budget hearing in advance. So if you do want to sort of work up some advocacy and work up some press around an issue you're trying to get into the budget, doing a budget hearing in January can be a good way to get your issue on the table, so to speak, before the budget process formally kicks off. So this budget, right, is about $520 million. It starts February 1st in the charter, right? And so each department head has to send a copy of their itemized budget request to the budget office. And for the purposes of what counts as a city department, right, in this case, Common Council is also a city department, right? So Common Council will also send in their budget for their staff and their salaries, things of that nature, right? So while they are a branch of government, they are also a city hall department in a sense. So all the department requested budgets go to the mayor's office February 1st. Once the mayor's office has them, right, they can workshop them. So if the Parks Department says, hey, I want $20 million for a new park, the mayor's office can say, no, I want that money to go to the police, right? And so they can drop things, add things, review things. And so the mayor's office has to finish up their draft of the budget by May 1st and deliver that to the Common Council. So then the Common Council has between May 1st and May 22nd to hold any sort of hearings or council workshops on the budget and review it and vote on it. One other thing that does happen in between that timeline, between the mayor releases the budget and the council votes on the budget, is the Comptroller certifies that the sort of revenue and expenditure numbers from the mayor's office are accurate to some extent. And this is not any sort of like hard veto, but it does give the council the opportunity to look at the numbers and say, hey, you know, you're saying we're going to take in $520 million of revenue. The Comptroller is saying those numbers aren't accurate. So one thing that happens during this council process, right, is so they can take one of three actions. They can approve the budget as is, they can reject the budget, and they can amend the budget. So if they approve the budget as is, right, they get a majority of council members to just say yes, right, then it goes back to the mayor's office and everything's fine. If they reject the budget, then I guess the mayor has to come up with a new budget or revise it, right, to get it to pass the Common Council. If the Common Council amends the budget, right, so what can happen is, let's say the Common Council looks at the budget and they say, you know, we don't like, you know, $100 and something million going to the fire department. We're going to eliminate a few positions there, and we're going to, you know, hire some people to work in public works filling potholes, right? So they can eliminate that spend and they can replace it somewhere else. Or in their amendments, they can just eliminate entirely. And so if they pass amendments, then it goes back to the mayor's office for approval. If the mayor rejects the amendments, then the budget goes back to the Common Council for a 2/3 override. So you can think about that in a similar way as to how like a bill works through Congress and the federal government, where council gets the budget, they pass an amendment to it. If the mayor likes it, it's fine. If the mayor doesn't like it, the council needs 2/3 of council vote to override the mayor and pass their amendment. The one thing the council can't do during this process is they can't increase spending without decreasing spending somewhere else. So they can cut and they can cut and replace, but they can't simply add. So that's the process. So next slide, I have some numbers, but I just want to pause for a minute on the process to see if anybody has questions on the process. Okay. Let's see here. So I have a question about draft budgets. So So typically, it's not available to the public until May 1st when it goes to the council. It's my belief that you should be able to send in a FOIL request for the department budgets that go in on February 1st to the mayor's office. I have put in a request to those in the past. And unfortunately, I had gotten to the point where in order to get them, I would have needed to file an Article 78 proceeding in court to force the administration to release them. And at the time, I just didn't have the energy and the wherewithal to continue with a small court case to force the handover of documents. So while they are typically not made available, it's my belief that legally they should be available. But again, that's just my opinion. So other questions we have. So let's see here. How much is the operating budget? So it's $520 million in total this year. Generally, that number goes up every single year.
Initiative INIT.
Tangentially related, curious if there's a Coral-like opportunity in Buffalo that promotes systems analysis approach for public servants. I don't know. That one would be out of my depth. Let's see, someone saying, Vanessa is saying, according to the charter, President, the Common Council, and the Chair of the Finance Committee are involved with the mayor's budget dealings with the departments. Is it a wise strategy to get the Common Council to hold hearings reporting back on this process? Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I think that kind of probably depends on your overall advocacy strategy and the amount of time that you have to hold the Common Council accountable to doing that. I like budget hearings. I like public hearings, but again, the amount of time that it can take to make that happen and the amount of value that you get out of that is probably going to be dependent on your individual organization and where you're at with your campaign. So, but I will say that in the past, right? Like, the one thing that's nice about doing public hearings on the budget is that you can turn people out to them, and it can become a very galvanizing moment for folks, right? So a lot of people have never been to a budget hearing before, and when they get into a budget hearing and they start seeing the numbers and they start seeing, you know, where their money is going, that can be a really good organizing opportunity. And public hearings are being held. The other thing is press around these events. And so
Brian, you're breaking up again.
Oh no.
We did miss a bit of that response. In terms of holding public hearings around the council of holding hearings around budget earlier on the process. So I think it depends on your overall organization strategy. Maybe one thing we could try is if you wanted to, if you could call in by phone, and you can click through the slides on your computer.
event. It's typically coming on makes it a little easier for organizations on the support. It gives you an opportunity to unit the press release about what turns out use it to basic news tasks instead of your own little box. Right?
Brian, we're still not able to hear you.
Yeah.
He's going to try to dial in from his phone while he's sharing the screen.
Yes,
Yeah, we'll be sending out this information too. We'll give him a couple more minutes to call back in. I think right now, while we're waiting, Andrea is going to jump in and share a little bit about an upcoming workshop.
Hello, friends. My name is Andrea O'Sullivan, for those I don't know, and I'm director at Partnership for the Public Good. So thanks for hanging tight here. I'm sure we're going to work it out and get Brian back. I wanted to share as well, I know I saw in the comments a number of you who are particularly interested in the Buffalo police budget at this time. That's something we were definitely expecting with this workshop. I think we will go into that a bit today, but we also wanted to share that we will be having a second workshop devoted specifically to the police budget 2 weeks from today at the same time. So on Wednesday, July 8th at noon. And that will be Brian, will be Vanessa joining us, and we'll have a couple of our partners who have been advocating for police budget changes here as well. We've been supporting that group to really go through the line items and look at strategies from other cities on how reductions and alternatives can be put in place. So if that's really what brought you here, please also come back to us 2 weeks from today on July 8th.
All right, how's that? Can everybody hear me? All right. Testing 1 2 1 2.
Sounds good. And I think we missed
Okay.
the answer to the last question that you were trying to answer.
Okay, great. Yeah, sorry about that. So in terms of getting folks involved, getting the Common Council involved to hold hearings earlier on in the budget process. So I think it depends on your sort of overall organizing strategy and the capacity that you have and how much time you want to dedicate to it. So I have found that in the past, budget hearings can be a good way to get people sort of galvanized and organized around the budget. For a lot of folks, they've never been to a budget hearing before. And so being able to turn folks out to it and having them see decision makers, people in power, and also being able to see the numbers around the budget sort of in real time can be a moment that can get a lot of people sort of very agitated around the budget. And it can also be very educational. That and the other side of that too, right, is there's an opportunity there to run press, right? So anytime there's a hearing in City Hall, right, you have an opportunity to capture that narrative and send out your own press releases and do your own press conference around the budget, around any sort of budget hearing that you might want to spin up. So they definitely have their place, and they can be useful. However, they can also be a lot of work, and you may get tired at talking at the Common Council and having nothing happen. So there's sort of two sides to that coin, right? So I mean, I'm generally all in favor of, more transparency and more public communication when it comes to budgets and government process in general. But the other reality is that you are almost always going to have to do the work to get people there. And to hold folks accountable to making sure that those hearings happen, unless there is a law passed that mandates that they have to do it. But then even when that law is passed, right, they're just going to do the bare minimum. So, so it all depends. I would say it all depends on where you and your people are at any given point in time. All right, and then let's see. So then. Are these three budgets different or three parts of one budget? Yeah, so that's a great question. So, so as I mentioned before, and I'll peek ahead at the next slide real quick. Sorry, not really. So I won't peek ahead, but so the capital budget, as I mentioned before, it's all bonded projects, right? And so they're loans, and so those loans have to be paid back, and so where does the money come from to pay back those loans? The money to pay back those loans comes out of this operating budget. So the money comes from the operating budget. However, the process for determining expenditures on the capital budget is a separate process with a separate timeline and somewhat different decision makers through that process. The community development block grant funds, those are a separate pot of money from the federal government. With a completely separate process. So Courtney wants to know, let me make sure I have this. The only formal public hearing on the budget is after the Common Council has already voted on it. I'm floored. Sorry, so I should have elaborated more on that. So during that period between May 1st and May 22nd, the Common Council is required to hold at least one public hearing. And so there has to be at least some point in time where the public can come and comment on the budget, or at least and have that hearing on it. There are a number of internal City Hall workshops that also happen during that time. Some years, this Common Council has allowed residents to participate in those workshops. Other years they haven't, right? And the difference between the workshop and the hearing is that the hearing is, everybody goes into council chambers and you just come up on the agenda and you can speak. The workshops are where council sits in meetings with department heads and they go over the department budgets in a more fine-tooth manner. And again, depending on the year, sometimes council will let people in on those workshops, but if not, then the only required point of public input or public review is during that Common Council hearing that has to happen between May 1st and May 22nd. Has social distancing impacted the time frame? Yeah, so this year, I don't entirely understand the sort of legal processes for how that works, but somehow Governor Cuomo said, hey, because of coronavirus, cities and municipalities can extend out their budget process timelines. And so this year, the budget for the Common Council actually got voted on later than it did initially. So, is the Board of Education budget also made public as a part of this? So the Board of Education is not something I have a tremendous amount of insight in. I know a little bit about it, but the Board of Education budget is around $900 million. Only 70 or so million of that comes from the city of Buffalo. Yeah, but I'm not an expert on the BOE budget. Let's see. Yeah, and as far as the PowerPoint calls going out, yeah, I've definitely got those slides for distribution. So after that, if someone from PPG wants to send those out, that's awesome by me. Okay, so a question from David. Generally speaking, if a member of the community has an idea for a program or initiative, who/how might one proceed? Is there a formal process? Okay, to address this later if someone covers this later. Yeah, I mean, so if you have an idea for a program or an initiative, a lot of that's going to depend on where you want the money to come from. So if you want it to come from, right, the mayor's budget, right, then you would have to look at who makes decisions during that process, right, and try to target those folks to get your items slipped into the budget at some point. Right, if you're looking at the capital budget, same thing, right? So again, you're going to want to look at the process. You're going to want to look at who has the authority or the ability to insert something into the budget, right? And then try to pressure that person to put that into the budget. And then while simultaneously making sure that someone later in the process doesn't remove it. So. Okay, I think, yeah, so Michelle, to your question, so in terms of like, they'll just do as little as possible and that's just how things are. Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, right, power typically likes to hide in the shadows, right? And so while some of this is, and while some of these documents are available, right, through like say the Common Council's meeting minutes portal, right, typically, nobody wants to do more work than they have to. At least that's been my experience. But and I can show you sort of a bit at the end, right? If you do want to fish for documents and you do want to see to be able to get ahead on some of these things, right? A couple tricks for where we can find some of these documents online. All right, I think that was everything. So I'm going to move on to expenditures. So when we look at the City of Buffalo's budget, in the budget, there's a chart, this pie chart here that shows where that money's going, right? So it says about 20% is going to police, 15% is going to fire, public works, other departments, yada, yada, yada. But then there's this big section called fringe benefits that's, you know, around 38% of the total budget. Now, I personally find this somewhat misleading, right? Because fringe benefits ultimately are related to an employee somewhere, right? So health insurance is a huge cost, right? Pensions are a huge cost. And so
Brian,
whenever I look at the budget,
quick thing, the slide hasn't changed for us. Okay.
Oh, it hasn't? That's strange.
Perfect, we got it.
Okay, great. Okay, so now that we can see the slide, right, so what are these fringe benefits and where do they come from? That's always the question I want to ask, because if we want to calculate the true cost of a department or of a service in the City of Buffalo, right, all these employee fringe benefits are a part of that cost. So if we go into the budget and we break it down, what do these numbers actually look like? So this is the most recent budget for 2020, 2021. So as it currently stands, about $145 million goes to police. Somewhere around $110 million goes to the fire department. The school board gets about $72 million. Public works, parks, streets, little under 50. So capital debt service, this is where we're paying for all of those loans on those capital projects. That gets about, you know, $27, $28 million. right? Miscellaneous. So this is an actual budget expenditure item, and miscellaneous tends to cover things like electricity, toilet paper, right? All the sorts of the gas bill, various odds and ends within City Hall. Administration, finance, and urban affairs, right? So one thing to note, this fringe miss here. So once you go through and you account for all of the fringe benefits expenditures for the individual apartments, there's still a little bit of money left over in that fringe benefits category. And I don't have a super great understanding of what exactly that is. My gut tells me it's paying for the overhead and the administration of the fringe benefits as opposed to the actual benefit itself. But so on this chart, I've got it labeled as fringe miscellaneous. Right, and so then, you know, we've got a bunch of other departments, right, all the way from permits and inspections down to common council, assessment and taxation, city clerk, all coming in at their respective dollar amounts of, you know, maybe around $7 million or so, plus or minus, right? And then this year there was a little weird little line in there where there's a quote unquote capital projects line item for $400,000. And so it just goes to show you that even though we have a capital budget, sometimes capital projects show up even in the quote unquote operating budget. So that's the dollar amount. I do have another slide on breaking it down from a pie chart perspective, right? So if we want to look at the percentage, right, currently of that $520 million, about 28.1% to police, fire 21, school board 13, and so on and so forth. So any questions about the overall dollar amounts? So the law line item is for the law department in City Hall. So yeah, so the quote unquote legal department as opposed to city court. I don't know specifically how city court gets funded. So clarification on the police budget amount. Yeah, so the police budget amount is primarily salaries. And so we definitely get more in depth into this during the police budget workshop, but it's about 800 quote unquote sworn officers, right? So detectives, traffic cops, things of that nature, you know, C district, A district, what have you, and about 300 civilian personnel. Then there's also the sort of the mechanics garage and things of that nature. But primarily, you know, most of that police budget, in terms of how we get that number. So yeah, so in terms of like methodology, yeah, we can get into a little bit how those numbers come up, but there is, I'm gonna parking lot that, and then we'll come back to it, and I'll show you like where those numbers actually came from and how I pulled those out. Yeah, so what's included in miscellaneous? Yeah, so miscellaneous is, again, so that's another thing we can take a look at, but it's usually like keeping the lights on at City Hall, like the electric bill, the gas bill, things like that. What are the tiny slivers in unlabeled? So in terms of the tiny slivers that we have up here, those would be those smaller sections kind of down here, like city clerk, assessment and taxation, common council, that just aren't large enough to really show well on a graph in relation to some of these other larger department budgets. Let's see here. Settlements the city has to pay due to police misconduct. Where is that listed, do you think? So as far as I know, there's not a budget line item that says police misconduct. How they pay for that is a really good question. If I wanted to research that, I would probably look through the Comptroller's office to see specifically how that money is getting cut. But because those are not necessarily planned expenditures, they wouldn't typically show up in a budget process, right? If we were planning for police misconduct, that probably wouldn't look too good politically. So something like that you wouldn't necessarily see in the budget. I've heard, rumors that some of that may get pulled out of sort of weird costs in the fringe benefits section because City Hall self-administers some of the financing around health insurance and things like that. But that's, again, I don't have a lot of great evidence for that. So not entirely sure how they pull up the money out when there's a settlement.
And just one of the earlier questions are grants that the city gets reflected as income that will be allocated in the mayor's budget? Are those reflected separately? For example, BSA gets a grant for sewage infrastructure.
Yeah, so it's different departments. So yeah, so depending on, so it depends on the kind of grant, right? So so government finance can be tricky, right? In the sense that, like, let's say a lot of our roads, for example, like if Broadway gets repaved and that money comes from the state, because it's a specific state project, even though the money is sort of being spent locally, if a check's not getting cut to the city of Buffalo, something like that wouldn't show up. But if you look in the specific line items for different agencies, you often will see grants coming in to those agencies or to those departments as a revenue source. So it kind of depends on the grant and the department and the nature of the agency. As specifically with regard to BSA, I guess part of my understanding of BSA is that it's a public authority, and so it's somewhat of a separate administrative body from city government, even though it has city appointees. So I don't know if that would be reflected. Yeah, so I see question, these charts have too little information on them for even just a basic charter graph. Yeah, so I have the numbers with more specific information that I can send out to folks if they want to see. But ultimately, right, with all of the departments, right, if we were to keep adding more information, the graphs would get very blurry very quickly. But if you do want to dive in more, right, I do have these numbers broken out in a separate spreadsheet that we can send out along with the slides. And I do have some links at the end of this presentation that can show you, that can give you access to some of those more detailed numbers. Yeah, general fund total appropriations under the mayor's recommended budget this year shown as $418 million. How does this align? Okay, so that's sort of another methods question. So I'll parking lot that, and then when we get into Vanessa's question around how we look at the numbers, we can tack that on. Okay. Okay, so I'm seeing some statements. I'm trying to make sure the school board refer to education overall, or specifically the costs associated with the school board and the administrative work. So in this case, the school board line item is what's called an interfund transfer. So it's literally just the city cutting a check to the school board and saying, hey, here's $70 million, right? So what the school board uses that for, right, is going to get lumped in with the school board's overall budgeting process. So it's literally just saying, hey, we appreciate the school board and we appreciate the school board $70 million worth, so we're going to dedicate a portion of city revenue to go to the school board and be determined through the school board's process. Okay, I think that's all of it. So yeah, so let's get back into Vanessa's question. So, all right, so how did we come up with the dollar amounts for police? So, So I'll start here with the numbers that I used to come up with that figure, and then we can keep working back if we need to. So, right, so $124 million for police public safety, $1.2 million for police fleet maintenance, 0.7 million for building maintenance, and about 20 million for police civilians. So in terms of how I came up with these numbers or where I pull these from, go to the City of Buffalo's website. Need to find the right document here, so give me a moment. Yeah, so this is the document that I would use, right? So this City of Buffalo Summary of Department Revenues and Appropriations, right? So in here we get each sort of division within each agency, and we get the amount of appropriations, the amount of fringe benefits, and the amount of revenue. So in terms of calculating the total cost of police, what I would do is go in here and grab these different numbers and then add them up. So the cost of fringe benefits, the cost of appropriations, and then combine those all to get a total number for the police department. One thing I will say is that in terms of like a methods thing, if you do go to do sort of historical research, sometimes the format of the budget does change in terms of sometimes where numbers can be located. So for example, if you were to go back 10 years ago, this breakdown wouldn't necessarily be in the budget. And you'd have to go into each department's section by detail in the budget to pull those numbers out. Whereas now those numbers have been moved around. So it's, yeah, but for the current budget, this is where I would pull that information from. In terms of how do we come up with the $520 million in appropriate? Actually, let me just pause real quick and say, Vanessa, is that kind of the information you were looking for?
Just say, can I just talk instead of type? Is that okay? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Yeah, that was what I was talking. I was looking in the same place, but police civilians is several lines down, and I didn't even realize that wasn't included in there. So I'm glad you clarified that. Because
okay, cool.
Yeah.
So in terms of where do we get the overall $520 million from? I have to remember which document it's in. I don't remember if it's this one or if it's another one, but let me look real quick through this document. Okay, not this document. All right, my computer's running real slow today, so. Yeah, sorry, next time I will try and zoom in if I can. Okay. 2021 recommended budget. All right, so let's look here. Yeah, and so I guess real quick, one of the things that I would say in terms of calculating that total number, right, is if you add up each of those departments and the fringe benefits lines, but then you also include the school, interfund transfer, and the debt service. I think Zoom is crashing my computer today.
We can also send it out at the end too.
Yeah. So you can see some of that. Let me see if I can find that line item here real quick though, for that $520 million number. Yeah, so this is it right here. So if we look at City of Buffalo recommended budget grand total, right, 2020, 2021 recommended budget is $519 million. So the $418 million you were referencing was the spending to date, right? So that's how much City Hall has accounted for in current spending. So that's where we get that from. And that is this document, General Fund Appropriation Summary by Department. Yeah, so that's where that comes from. Okay. All right. So I think that I think that does it for questions around budget spending. Okay. So let me go back to the slides here. So one thing I want to show y'all real quick, right? So if you are looking to figure out how to get your hands on these documents, so one of the nice things that Common Council does is they maintain a meeting minutes portal, and so you can log in. You don't even need to log in; it's publicly accessible, and so you can go when you know the timeline around the budgets, right, and when some of these documents are supposed to be sent to the Common Council. You can go and you can search for meetings in their meetings portal, and then you're able to pull out the attachments, right, to be able to view some of these documents, right? So when the Common Council is appointing someone, or when they are, when the mayor has to send, let's say, his recommended capital budget to the council, right, we can go into the meeting portal and we can pull out some of these documents, right? And so this is an example of, right, what the mayor actually sends to the Common Council when he has that deadline of sending them his proposed budget that has all of the line items in it. And that's how I'm able to pull out like that document that we had in the slide before. And so I know, when I had spoken with Andrea, there was kind of some interest in sort of, what's the council's actual ability to make amendments. So I'm going to show you the council's budget amendments for this year, and sort of what they did to the budget once they got it. And so again, just pulled this out of the Common Council's meeting minutes portal, budget amendments for recommended 2020, 2021. Open this up. So make this a little bit bigger here. All right, so what did the Common Council do when they got the mayor's budget this year? Well, they did a couple of things. So whenever you see these parentheses, that indicates that they're cutting spending. And whenever you see a number without parentheses, that indicates that they're adding spending. So in this case, for council member number 4, not entirely sure who that is, but they cut spending for a legislative assistant and they added spending for a senior legislative assistant. So presumably somebody got a raise and a promotion. Also, out of the Common Council's legislation budget, they cut $94,000 and they added it into Common Council neighborhood initiatives. What neighborhoods, whose initiatives? I got no idea. The other thing they did, right, is they added $38,000 into citizen services for a complaint clerk. And then they added a building supervisor of maintenance, another $51,000 position. And so, you know, when they take out the legislation salary and they move that into neighborhood initiatives, they get, you know, an even balance, right? But when they give this guy a promotion, they have a $20,000 or, you know, $11,000 or so deficit. And then, of course, when they add these two in, they add on another $38,000 and another $51,000. And so, as I said before, right, the Common Council, they can replace spending, but they can't add to the total. So whenever they add something in, they've got to cut. And so how did they pay for this guy's promotion, this new complaint clerk, and this new supervisor of maintenance? Well, they took the money out of the healthcare retiree line item. So that's how they were able to move the money around. So, right, so if, for example, you wanted to hire new social workers in City Hall, right, and Common Council said, you know, well, we don't have the money for it, right? Well, you could say, hey, you know, go cut, you know, 5 beat cops salaries, right, and then reallocate that spending elsewhere. So just as an example, right? So this is an example of the Common Council amendment that they pass every year. Another thing that's interesting in this, I think it's this document, so it's 2 pages. So the mayor also sent a, is it this one? Oh, never mind, I lied. Next page is just blank. Yeah, okay, there we go. Oh, no, here it is. So the mayor, so after the council got the budget, the mayor sent another document to the council saying, hey, I'm revising the numbers that I sent you, right? And he said, I'm going to change my numbers and I'm going to amend the revenue estimates such that I'm going to remove $1 million from my traffic violation fines and fees estimate, and I'm going to magically replace that money with money from increased sales tax. So yeah, so there's that. I have lots of thoughts and feelings about this, but I imagine you do too, so I'll save my opinion. So that's, yeah, so that's a little example of what the budget amendments look like, and some of the power of being able to use the Common Council's meeting portal to pull out some of these documents. The other thing that I would recommend too is a lot of what I've given you around process, to some extent has been simplified, right, for the sake of presentation to a general audience. But if you want to like really get down in the budget process, right, the budget process is a matter of law to a large extent. And so as a result, you can read the law in the city charter governing the budget process, specifically Chapter C, Article 20, which is linked in the slides. And so if you really want to read through the budget process in a really like in-depth manner, this is the place to go for that. And this is where a lot of my, really most if not all of my research on timelines and process came from in terms of how the budget process works. So yeah, so if you're really curious to like nerd out on the budget, check out the city charter. Okay, yeah, I think that is what I had planned. So let me see if we have more questions.
We're gonna ask people to type a lot of questions in the chat. And if it's okay, we just wanted to invite Vanessa to share just some thoughts and reflections while people are typing their questions, if that works. So as we mentioned earlier, Vanessa Glacierski has worked as Deputy and Acting Comptroller for the City of Buffalo. So before we turn to your questions, which we encourage you to type into the chat, we just want to invite her to add any reflections or thoughts she had for today.
Yeah, well, thank you. I just want to first thank Brian. Thank you for this presentation. I thought it was really great, and I appreciate all the work that you put into going through this. And I really appreciate the point about, you know, this is a matter of law, and it's really important to look through the charter You know, one of the things that I noticed when I was brushing up on the charter in preparation for just being able to give some thoughts on this, you know, when I looked through the budget process, it's under the charter section 20-8. It goes through the process of what the council members have the option to do, whether they have the option to adopt the budget or amend, like what Brian just was talking about. But if now, you know, we get upset, you know, or at least I have gotten upset when the council members are not rejecting some of these budgets, because I mean, there are a lot of issues that I've found with these, but I mean, if you're just even talking about the police funding, for example, if you look at the charter though, the way that it's written, if they don't do anything, if nothing is done and there's no budget adopted by, I think it's the 3rd week of June or something like that, then the budget gets adopted basically as is, with whatever the mayor proposed and whatever the common council, any kind of additions that the common council made that the mayor did not reject. So therefore, this charter lends itself to the common council members playing ball with the mayor, because otherwise, if they just voted no, then they don't really have any kind of leverage for getting the stuff that they want for their district. So it lends itself to the common council members, and this is my opinion. I guess somebody can disagree with me, but this is based on my reading of the charter. And I think that, you know, for one of the thoughts that I had in reading this was, you know, as far as advocacy is concerned, it might be worth thinking about at a later date how these processes, you know, affect, you know, in reality, the political reality of what we can expect from our council members in pushing back against things that we want them to push against. And I mean, even, you know, I asked the question about the timeline for the hearings and whether it's worth it to be having hearings in February. The reality is that once the mayor has already compiled his budget, you know, the political reality, at least from what I've seen, is that the only changes that you're going to see are the examples that Brian showed you. Small little tweaks here and there that council members will do to benefit, like, you know, if a legislative assistant wants a raise or whatever have you. But these aren't major sweeping changes. I mean, we still have large amounts of money going to police. And I also want to say, there are a couple more things I want to say too. You know, I find that there are very big issues with transparency. You know, the meeting portal, you're supposed to be able to find all this stuff there, including videos of hearings. And there have been several times where I've not been able to find hearings, including the hearing where the June 4th budget hearing, where there was some issue where they said that the numbers that advocates were coming up with, which was the $141 million, and they said that those numbers were bad, and they said that the organizations were making it more hard on themselves and that they should be coming with correct information. But, you know, as we saw, it's easy to disaggregate that information to make it look like, oh, you're crazy, because if you look at the one page on the budget, it says the police budget is like 86 million. But when you look at the appropriations chart, when it combines the amount that's been, actually it was not 86 million. I think that was the year before. It's like 74 million. And then if you look at that number plus the fringe benefits number, which is not combined with it elsewhere, you know, less the revenues that they're expected to bring in, then you come up with 121 million. And like I said, several lines down, you'll find $20 more million for police civilians. And then, you know, I didn't even find out where the garage was because I didn't see it. So, but that's all part of the cost. But again, I think that as advocates, we need to be really prepared to go in and list out these numbers, list out the department numbers, and really go toe to toe, because there is an interest in misinformation and skewing the truth here. Sorry, are you there?
Yeah, thanks so much, Vanessa.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. Okay, so I guess maybe dive into some of the questions now.
Yep.
All right, so I am going to try and go first in, first out. And let me just scroll up here. Okay, so question about, say more about fines and fees. I wish I could. I will say that I find this fines and fees number particularly odd. And I find it odd for a couple of reasons. So one, right, this letter makes it look like the mayor cut spending to cut the amount of money that he's going to generate from fines and fees, but I'm pretty sure that previously this number was actually lower than 4.5. So he took 2 steps forward and 1 step back. It's also just odd to me that you can just like say, hey, I'm going to cut the amount of like tickets we issue to people as a portion of revenue, as though you were just like selling widgets or like, you know, I don't know, selling, you know, juice or something. It seems odd to me to quantify, right, like the monetary value of law enforcement in such a way that makes it so discretionary and so willy-nilly. So when I look at this, right, I see this more of a I don't know, some sort of weird political game that's going on here. Because also likewise, like how do you just say we're going to recoup that money from sales tax, right? Like I don't know, these numbers just feel inherently funny to me. You know, also like what are you going to do? Like you're going to reach the police department's going to reach $4.5 million in traffic violations fines, and they're just going to stop handing out citations. Like, I don't know. So this doesn't make any sense to me. You know, and you know, and really, you know, this breakdown isn't any more detailed in the budget than just this line. This is an individual line item. You know, if you did want to get more detailed information, you'd probably have to FOIL for specific data around the violations themselves over the course of a year. So that's, I don't know, that's my small bit about fines and fees. I hope that's somewhat informative. I don't know if that answers the question though, but parlaying that into another question that got asked around, you know, how much of a reflection of this budget is what's actually going to be spent, and you know how much of this can change over the course of a year. So budgets are projections, right? They're plans, but City Hall doesn't always go as planned, right? So if you know the police commissioner says, hey, everybody's working overtime, you know, everybody's picking up extra shifts, right? Then the cost on police spending may increase. So if you know City Hall has a bunch of people retire and you know they just decide not to fill those positions, right? Then you may see some spending decrease, right? So you know, generally their guides, their plans, they're good for understanding you know the budget overall and sort of the big picture. But certainly some things can change and some things will change, you know, as the year goes on. But generally, I find, and if you do want to look at like actual expenditures, the budget does list prior year spending in the budget, right? So you can go through and compare, okay, this is what we projected, this is what we actually spent, to an extent.
Well,
yeah,
and
right. So
I think that's a great point, and I'll just point out to your point, Brian. And if you look at what's been budgeted for police for overtime, not just police overtime, but for overtime, and compared to what the actual expenditures were, like you know, many years in a row they budgeted around 17 million and consistently spent about 29 million. That number did go down last year. I think it was more like 19 million, I believe. But still, even though they've only budgeted $17 million for overtime this year, that doesn't mean that that's what it's going to be, which means that, you know, that the police budget could be more than what they're projecting, like you said.
Yeah, and so, yeah. Yeah, and to that end, right, I think a couple of years ago, right, it was found out that there were some folks in the fire department that were working 48-hour shifts, right, and somehow clocking tons and tons of overtime because somehow they were able to work, you know, multiple days in a row straight. Okay, so, fines and fee funding, where does parking enforcement go? Shouldn't that go to roads and the NFTA? So, so the way that the fines and fees get collected is that they come into the city budget overall, right? So that big revenue pie chart, it's just one little slice of the overall revenue. And then everything gets chopped up and redistributed. So there isn't any specific sort of designated spend on any of those fines and fees, you know, at least on paper or, you know, in any formal context, right? But if you wanted to go to City Hall and say, hey, you know, all these fines and fees that you're collecting should go to increase bus service, send that check to the NFTA, right? That could be something you'd advocate for. But right now on paper, there's nothing that specifically would tie that to go to any particular spend.
Yeah, there was a question too that said, I tuned into the June 4th Common Council meeting that Vanessa mentioned and tried checking out the budget beforehand. Found it extremely difficult to understand. Do you have any tips or advice as to how to navigate the documents successfully?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say, so I guess the thing I would say is take it slow and ask yourself lots of questions, right? So what do you personally want to know about the budget, right? Do you want to know how much money there is overall? Do you want to know how much money a specific department gets? Do you want to know how much community service gets versus police gets, right? And so what I would do, and the way I approached this, right, is I would start asking myself questions, and I would keep revisiting the various budget documents to answer those questions. You know, the budget as you know, an overall thing is huge, right? It's like, I don't know, hundreds of pages, right? And so I wouldn't recommend reading it front to back in that kind of a, you know, linear order. But I would just start with a place of what's your initial curiosity and keep coming back to it, right? And keep going through it. And eventually what'll happen is you'll start to understand the structure of the budget, and you'll know where to look for certain kinds of information. But the other thing I'll tell you is, like, I've been paying attention to the budget for, I don't know, maybe 6 years now. And it still takes me a little bit. Like, when I went to go rework these numbers, I was like, man, where do they put that number again? Is it here? Is it there? Right. And so I guess I'll say also just be gentle with yourself, because it's a lot of information and it's a very concentrated document. I mean, those would be my tips. I don't know, Vanessa, if you have any tips on how you would approach navigating and learning more about the budget.
No, I mean, I totally agree with you. And I can tell you, you know, don't feel ashamed, because I'm a CPA and have been in public accounting in my career. And it's still, as someone who's familiar with financial statements, the budgeting process as a whole is something entirely different. And it is a very complex document, and it takes some time to get used to. So I totally second that. You know, be gentle with yourself and just take your time and ask. I mean, and this is why I think we do need a more robust budget process, because, you know, we do need to be able to ask questions. And, you know, I really hope that, you know, in my ideal world, these budget workshops would be happening and, like, be overwhelmingly attended, you know, so that we all do have a very good understanding.
So I do think we're 1 minute past time today. I saw that there were a couple of questions, and I'll put them back to Brian so that we'll be able to maybe connect one off to try to answer them. But as Andrea mentioned, We're going to be sending out a survey after this, and we also have a more in-depth police budget workshop. We did bill this as a 101, so kind of understanding the process and some of the high-level numbers, but we do hope to get a little bit more in-depth with our next one, specifically around the police budget, because as Vanessa and Brian both shared, it gets a little tricky and very complicated even for folks who are really familiar with this. So we invite you to both fill out your survey, ask additional questions. We appreciate your patience with all the technical difficulties we have, but we will be sending out a recording of this as well, in addition to some of the resources. But feel free to direct any additional questions either in the chat in the next couple of minutes or to buffalocommons@cornell.edu. But a huge thanks to Brian and Vanessa for sharing their time today with us. And we're excited to learn more from them on July 8th. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for letting me be here.
All right, yeah, thank you so much. All right, have a great day.